Ever get that like kind of nervous feeling when you hear the word risk? Especially when you're in the thick of a Scrum project.
Yeah, totally.
I think we all do. Well, today we're going to tackle this head on. We're diving into a whole bunch of articles and blog posts all about risk management, specifically in the Scrum framework. And get this, we might even end up seeing risk as, well, not the big bad wolf we often make it out to be.
I'm in. Sounds intriguing.
Right. So these articles, they don't just like define risk and leave it at that. They actually give us a ton of practical tools and strategies, real world stuff to help us wrap our heads around risk management in the Scrum world.
It's true. They do. It's like they get that just knowing what risk is isn't enough.
Exactly. Like we need that action plan, right?
Exactly, yeah.
But before we jump into the how-tos, I think we got to address this whole idea that risk is inherently a bad thing because, let's be honest, it often feels like a giant stop sign.
Right. And it's interesting because even though we might initially see it as a negative thing, I think one of the articles actually called it out, making risk management for Agile projects effective. And they made a really good point. The Scrum Guide doesn't actually have a separate section specifically for risk management.
Oh, interesting. So are they saying we should just throw caution to the wind? Just like hope for the best?
Not at all. See, that's the cool part about Scrum. It kind of embeds risk management within its DNA.
Okay.
So every sprint, every time you refine the backlog, each retrospective, those all act like built-in risk assessment tools. It's already woven into the process.
So it's less about having this whole separate risk management plan. It's more about using the Scrum framework itself to manage those risks.
You got it. It's like, think about sprints for a second. You're breaking down those big, scary projects into these smaller, bite-sized pieces, right?
Right.
And that allows you to constantly gather feedback, adjust as you go. It's that whole iterative thing. So you can spot those risks early on before they become big problems.
It's like they say, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
Scrum kind of spreads things out, makes the whole system more resilient. I like that.
Exactly. And don't forget about the product backlog, which, it's like, it's not just a to-do list, right?
Right.
One of the articles, 5 Ways Scrum Helps Manage Risks, it talked about how prioritizing those high-risk, high-value items right up front, that lets product owners test their assumptions quickly.
Oh, I see. So you're getting that feedback early on.
Exactly. And it reduces the chances of, building something that nobody wants.
Right. Those minimum viable products. Get them out there, test the waters. It's all about mitigating risk right from the get-go.
It is.
It's like Scrum saying, hey, uncertainty is part of the game, so let's use it to our advantage.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's another article, How to Effectively Manage Risk in Scrum Projects, Proven Tools and Strategies. And it really emphasizes how Agile's ability to adapt to change, like changing requirements, that's a huge strength. It helps keep products aligned with what the market actually needs and what your users actually want.
It makes sense. So instead of fearing change, Scrum's like, okay, here's how we can work with it. Here's how we can navigate it.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, how do we actually put this into practice? Like our listeners are out there, they're working on Scrum teams. How can they start implementing these risk-aware strategies? It's like we've got all these great tools, right?
Yeah.
But we need that instruction manual. So where do we even begin?
Well, a lot of the articles actually give us a really clear roadmap. It's like a 4-step process. Identify, assess, respond, and then monitor.
Okay, roadmap. I like it. So let's start with identify. What does that look like when we're talking about Scrum?
So there's this article, Managing Risks in Agile Scrum by Simon Goodchild, and he's got some really practical advice, like brainstorming. It seems kind of basic, but it's really effective. Get the whole team together, throw out any potential risks, and don't,
Overthink it.
Exactly, yeah. Just get it all out there. And don't just rely on memory, right?
Right.
Goodchild also talks about looking back at past projects, using that historical data, see if there are any recurring issues, anything that might be a red flag.
Oh, interesting. So like we're looking for those patterns.
Exactly. And then, this might seem obvious, but don't underestimate those requirements. If they're not crystal clear, if they're way too ambitious, that's like a recipe for risk right there.
It's like building a house on a shaky foundation.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've identified the risks.
Yeah.
What's next on our roadmap?
Assessment. Because now that you've got this list, right,
Right.
you've got to figure out which of these are most likely to actually happen and what kind of impact they could have. Some might be no big deal.
Right.
Others, they could derail the whole project.
So how do we actually go about assessing them?
Well, there are a bunch of different methods. Some people like using a risk matrix. It's basically a visual tool, helps you see the likelihood and impact of each risk side by side.
Okay. So it's a way to kind of categorize those risks.
Exactly. But it doesn't have to be that fancy. Sometimes just talking it through as a team, deciding if a risk is high, medium, or low, that can be just as good, especially when you're first starting out.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've identified, we've assessed. Now, for the fun part, what do we do about it?
Now we're in the respond phase. And risk management in Agile, how to control risk in Agile. They break it down into 4 main responses: avoid, mitigate, transfer, or accept.
Okay, give us a scenario. Let's put this into practice.
Okay, how about this? You're working on a project and you need a third-party vendor for a really crucial component.
Okay.
But you've heard through the grapevine that this vendor, they've been having some major delays.
Uh-oh.
What do you do?
Well, we can't really avoid the risk altogether, right? We need that vendor. And transferring the risk, that doesn't really solve the problem.
Right.
So I think we'd need to mitigate it.
Exactly. And how would we do that?
Well, first off, talk to the vendor, let them know we're concerned, get a clear understanding of their timeline, and then we could start looking at backup options, maybe other vendors, or just having a plan B just in case those delays actually happen.
Perfect. You've identified the risk, and you're taking proactive steps to lessen the potential impact. That's risk mitigation in a nutshell.
Okay, this is making a lot more sense now.
Yeah.
So we've identified, assessed, responded. What's the final step in our risk management journey?
Well, the journey doesn't end there. The final step, and it's a big one, is to monitor those risks.
Monitor. So you don't just check it off the list and forget about it.
Definitely not. Risk is, well, it's kind of always changing, right?
Right.
What might seem like a small issue today could blow up tomorrow. So we got to stay on top of it, keep our eyes open, and be ready to, shift gears if we need to.
Okay, so how do we keep those risks front and center throughout the whole project? Like, should we have a dedicated risk meeting every week?
Well, remember those built-in Scrum events we were talking about earlier? The sprints, the backlog refinements, those retrospectives?
Yeah.
They're not just for show. We can use those as opportunities to circle back to our risks, see where things stand, and make adjustments to our game plan as needed.
So we're basically weaving risk management into the fabric of Scrum. It's not this separate thing. It's part of the conversation all along.
Exactly. And a simple approach for risk management in Scrum really hits this home, They talk about constantly checking in on those risks, making sure that risk register is always up to date.
Oh, I see. So nothing slips through the cracks.
Exactly. Everyone's in the loop. Everyone's prepared. But, there's another piece of this that we haven't really touched on yet, and it's a big one. The human element of risk management.
You keep mentioning that, and I got to ask, what does that even mean? Like, we've talked about the processes, the tools, but where do people fit into this whole thing?
Well, because even with all the best plans in the world, if we don't have a culture of open communication, if people don't feel comfortable speaking up, then things can still go off the rails.
So we got to make it safe for people to talk about risks.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, the people on the team, they're the ones who are going to be dealing with those risks firsthand.
Right. They're on the front lines.
Exactly. So their insights, their observations, those are super valuable.
Okay. So how do we create that kind of environment where everyone feels like they can speak up about risks without, being afraid to be wrong or being blamed for something?
Transparency is huge. Making risk management for Agile projects effective, they talk about this a lot, making sure everyone's on the same page.
Right, a shared understanding.
Exactly. Everyone needs to get why risk management matters, and they need to be on board with the approach you're taking.
Okay, so it's not enough to just identify the risks. You got to own them collectively as a team.
You got it. And risk management in Agile. How to control risk in Agile, they add to this too. They talk about the importance of the team, taking the time to really reflect throughout the project, like what went well, what could have gone better.
I like that.
Right. It's like by constantly reviewing and tweaking how we approach risk, we get better at it over time.
It becomes second nature almost.
Exactly. And this is important for everyone, by the way. Even those teams that have been doing Scrum forever, there's always room to improve when it comes to dealing with risk.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about identifying, assessing, responding to, and monitoring risks. And we even sprinkled in some wisdom about the importance of communication and teamwork. If our listeners could take away just one thing from this deep dive into risk management in Scrum, what would it be?
Don't freak out when you hear the word risk. Seriously, Scrum is built for this stuff. Embrace those iterations, talk to each other, and remember, this is a team effort. We're all in this together.
I love that. So well said. It's not about pretending risk doesn't exist. It's about facing it head on,
proactively and collaboratively. And on that note, a huge thank you to our expert for joining us on this deep dive into the world of risk management in Scrum. And to our listeners, until next time, happy Scrumming.